Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 51 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and today there were two discussion panels, roundtable discussions, focused again on the issues surrounding domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. So, if you've been following along with my pieces on this, you'll know that these are not the first such discussions. In fact, I was looking back and these were the 7th and 8th sessions that were focused entirely or mainly on the issues of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. Some crossover with those terms, but also somewhat interchangeable. Today, the sessions were intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, and family violence, police and institutional understanding, and responses to those issues. So there were, like I said, two panels today. As I mentioned before, these expert panels that have come in to talk about these issues, in none of the cases do they actually discuss Gabriel Wortman, Lisa Banfield, the events of April 18th, 19th, 2020, none of the issues of the mass casualty in Nova Scotia. I've talked about that before. I won't echo all that I've said. But I did note today now that the two moderators, Krista Smith in the morning, Dr. Emma Cunliffe in the afternoon, both took a little time at the beginning of their sessions to note that this is what these experts are here for, is to provide broader context for the commissioners and for the public. And so and noted that discussions on particular recommendations are not going to come until phase 3. So it would lead one to believe in perhaps that, well, at some point, an expert will come back, maybe the same experts, I'm not sure, and discuss the specifics of the events of April 18th, 19th, 2020, the surrounding circumstances, the lead up to it, the relationship between Wortman and Ms. Banfield, discuss all of those in the specifics and formulate recommendations based on this broader context which we are now engrossed in receiving or listening to. I wouldn't hold out great hope that that is going to take place. I'd be more apt to think that the commissioners, the experts that are brought back, are going to, yes, formulate recommendations, but I doubt that they are going to actually tie them back to the specifics of this scenario that we've learned something about throughout the last 51 days of proceedings. So we'll see what that amounts to. But I thought it was interesting that the two moderators both took a little time to explain that was the case. Well, they didn't explain, they explained that it was the case. They didn't explain why it was the case, why they've chosen to bifurcate the issues such as they have, but that's what they did anyway. So the other thing I'll note, so the panelists today for the first session were Dr. Carmen Gill from UNB, Dr. Laurie Chambers from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Dr. Patricia Duhaney from the University of Calgary, and Dr. Nancy Ross from Dalhousie. And those were 4. There was 6 in the afternoon. I'll come to those in a minute. But the 6 in the afternoon were also all female, all women presenters, experts today. And when I look back at the issues of domestic violence, intimate partner violence discussed during the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, all of the experts have been women. All of the people brought in by the Mass Casualty Commission to speak about these issues have been women. Seems like it would be an issue, if you bring it in, if it was an issue of sports, military, whatever, and you brought in only men to talk about it, I would think it would be fair for somebody to criticize that lack of diversity. And I think it's a problem that there's a lack of diversity on this topic. I mean, it just doesn't seem like there's... Anyway, there seems like there could be more discussion take place. Well, not that I'm advocating more discussion of this, because like I said, these were the 7th and 8th sessions on this. If the commissioners don't have a broad sense of the context of all of this by now, I'm not sure they ever could. So the first panel had lots to discuss. One of the things they took some time with was, it started off sort of hopefully. It was like, well, let's talk about this Nova Scotia case. And I was like, oh, you mean this case? No, not this case. Not Gabriel Wortman and Lisa Banfield, but Nicole Doucette and Mike Ryan. People may remember this case. About 2010, it got to court in Nova Scotia. The Supreme Court decided Miss Doucette was in an abusive relationship, had suffered for many years, and at some point was contacted by an undercover police officer who was posing as a hitman, saying, hire me, I will kill your husband. And she started engaging in those discussions and was charged with doing so. Went to trial with using a defense, not of self-defense, because she didn't actually self-defend, but of duress, saying because of the abuse suffered, she had was forced into this scenario where she felt that hiring a hitman was the only way out. Okay, so at trial, she was acquitted. At the Court of Appeal, she was also, the acquittal was upheld. The Crown appealed it to the Court of Appeal of Nova Scotia. On the panel and writing the decision was Chief Justice at the time, Michael MacDonald, who is now, of course, Lead Commissioner MacDonald. That was mentioned very briefly in the discussion, but nobody seemed to really tie it into Chief Justice MacDonald or see it as an issue one way or another, good or bad, that it was the same individual, judge, now commissioner, thinking about these issues. So we'll see if that materializes anything. It's not a problem. There's no conflict there, but it was more than a coincidence, but it really only got a passing mention in the discussion. So there was, actually, so that case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, where the Supreme Court didn't agree with the duress, usage of duress as a defense in that case. The broad definition was rejected. It was narrowed. But the Supreme Court also said that because of the time and everything Ms. Doucette had gone through, that it would be unfair for her to face a new trial, and so they stayed the charges against her. So that was all interesting, but has nothing to do with Ms. Banfield, Gabriel Wortman, or anything that the Commission is studying. The panelists called for big changes, all right? So their phrases like major paradigm shift at all levels of the justice system, full system changes, tear down the system. Okay, all of those things are fine, except, okay, so let's do it then, all right? It's so broad to the point of meaninglessness. Okay, we're going to have full system changes. All right, do it then. If that was a recommendation to just say, all right, well, we're going to have a major paradigm shift. All right, well, what does that mean? So that's a difficulty when you get into such broad language. They did talk about some of the police risk assessment tools they used, and this was sort of a circular discussion in a way, because they say, okay, so these ODERA tool, risk assessment tools for people in domestic violence situations, gives the police an additional insight into a situation. Okay, go through all these questions, and then there's a score at the end of it, and you can figure out from that if there's a real risk. As opposed to, so now, or prior to these tools, the police would do their investigation, ask some questions as they saw fit, and then make a judgment call using their discretion. Now what is in place are these tools, questionnaires to go through, leads to a score, but in a way to take the uneducated discretion out of it, which is essentially, without saying so, what they're talking about with these police officers. So now they'll have the system, they can use a score that they can refer to and say, okay, that's a risk, and we're going to do something about that, or we're going to record that at least. So now what these experts are saying is use those tools, but can keep an element of discretion for the police at the end of it. So instead of uninformed, uneducated discretion, it is informed, more educated discretion. So that was an interesting little sidebar discussion. The other thing that came out of the first morning, the morning session, was the notion of potentially criminalizing coercive control. Coercive control, well, there's a problem with defining coercive control, but basically what it means is, the man would, restrict the female's opinions, movements, friendships, relationships with other people, all in a strictly non-violent manner, but in such a controlling way so that it controls the person's movements, thoughts, and just friendships. So that is seen. So there was a suggestion from Ms. Dr. Chambers, that would be criminalized, and that would help reform the system. Other panelists seem to disagree with that. I agree with the others. It's a problematic. The others saw it as a problematic thing to add this notion of coercive control to a justice system that is still unreformed and problematic as it is. So they recommended, instead of adding coercive control as a criminal offense, as it evidently has been done in a certain way over in Scotland, to make a public health approach to it. I think that seems to be the more prevailing opinion among the experts that were speaking about it. So that was an interesting discussion, but the notion of coercive control is it's non-violent but still coercive, that is improper. So that can be addressed, I think. I tend to agree, better addressed through public health-like approaches, societal, systemic approaches, putting institutions in place that can help women get through these things and educate the public. So that's fine. The second panel was dealing more, again, with the police and institutional understanding of these issues of family violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. Second panel was led by Dr. Cunliffe and featured Emily Coyle, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, Lana McLean, a clinical social worker, African Nova Scotian lady who was involved as well, testified in the Desmond inquiry, did a great job there, I thought. Sunny Mariner, a national project leader of the Improving Institutional Accountability Project. Deepa Matau, who is the Executive Director of the Barbara Schliffer Commemorative Clinic. Dr. Pam Palmater from Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson. And Professor Isabel Grant from the Allard School, Law School in the University of British Columbia. So again, 6 panelists there, 10 on the day, all female, all kind of discussing these issues. So the women in the afternoon went through some of the myths, stereotypes, inherent biases that are featured in the systemic approaches to domestic violence. And so they were all, these issues are, I was thinking about this as they were talking. I mean, these notions are all being fought by these women, by the organizations they lead, by many others. And yet, of course, these systemic issues still persist. And so I think there's a risk or a concern I have, at least, that the Mass Casualty Commission will look at it only on those levels, which seems like you're taking a broad approach, but in a way you're only taking a surface approach if you say, well, there needs to be systemic changes and attitude changes and all these things. Well, that's great, but it's not very practical in ways. I think the Mass Casualty Commission needs to think more of these specific instances of, the Brenda Forbes report, how that happens, what happens, systemic, where does it go, where does the information go? Is there a criminal intelligence service that analyzes this and thinks about individuals and how that all goes? Is the information being compiled somewhere so that somebody can action it somehow? So more specific recommendations like that rather than sort of broad, systemic, just notions, I think is a better approach for the Mass Casualty Commission. We'll see if that's what they do. Now, they talked about all kinds of other things as well. They talked about barriers that criminalized women face when reporting sexual assaults in prisons and in the criminal justice system. African Nova Scotia women, the sexualization of them and the nuances associated with that. the immigrant experience in a new to the M system, forced marriages, those sort of questions, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report and the issues around that, all were sort of brought up and discussed briefly. The RCMP sexual abuse report by Justice Bastardash, former Supreme Court Justice, suggesting that police officers may not be best positioned to investigate allegations of sexual violence. Well, that's perhaps, I don't know if that's an indictment of the RCMP in particular or police more broadly, but so that's something that was discussed. All of these are very interesting, but again, of limited value, I think, for the Mass Casualty Commission if they're trying to make factual determinations. Well, until they make some factual determinations of the actual events of April 18th, 19th, 2020. But those were all discussed today. So those are the two discussion panels. We'll be back with further panels tomorrow. I wanted to mention just quickly a couple of articles that caught my eye. One was came out a couple of days ago. It was an opinion piece in the Toronto Star. I see it's gotten a lot of shares and resonance from, and the article was co-written by Farah Khan and Sarah Bosfeld, and it was suggesting that the headline is that Lisa Banfield is not and should not be on trial. People may have seen this article. There was a couple of factual mistakes in it. One was that it incorrectly noted or stated that the family members walked out before Miss Banfield's testimony. It was not true. They sat through the 3 hours of it, but then during the meetings, when it was clear that no other real questions were going to be asked, then they walked out before the sort of encore performance or the final set of questions that were asked after the 2-hour break. So that was only at that point the family walked out, so that was incorrect. The other one is it mentioned the decision to shield her from cross-examination, which they say is a shield that was also afforded to other witnesses, including the RCMP, as though to suggest that all RCMP officers were shielded from cross-examination, which was not quite true. There was only a couple of RCMP officers who were shielded from cross-examination. So to compare Miss Banfield to all the other witnesses as though to say she was treated just the same as everybody is not accurate either. And then it talks about these victim-blaming tropes, which it says, expect perfection on the part of survivors of intimate partner violence. And I thought about that. No, we don't expect perfection. No, she's not on trial, but do we expect nothing of a victim? I think of the expression, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Do we not expect anything from a victim under these circumstances? What do we expect? It's got to be something. And being able to answer some questions about what took place. Many victims of domestic violence have to go through that. Miss Banfield certainly could have as well. The other one was that just came out today, actually just from the last hour or so, was another article by Paul Palango, and this one focuses on Miss Banfield's lawyer, James Lockyer. I mentioned his name before, prominent certainly among lawyers nationally. Palango says he's charged $1,200 an hour, all paid for by the Mass Casualty Commission, which means all paid for by taxpayers. Mr. Lockyer has represented Reuben Hurricane Carter, Guy Palmeren, and David Milgaard, wrongfully convicted individuals, and also helped out Glenn Assoon, Nova Scotia case was pretty prominent a couple of years ago. Has done great work on those, but was contacted early, and in Palango's view at least, and I tend to agree with him, has been really dictating the terms of how Miss Banfield has been treated by the Mass Casualty Commission, how she's been perceived by the media and the public, and that everything she says has been believed with his help and with his coaching along. With her appearance last Friday, it was clearly she was quite well prepared. She had a strategy in mind and wasn't going to be providing any new insight or answers that she didn't want to provide. So interesting sort of look into James Lockyer and his role in supporting Miss Banfield. So all of that happened today. I'll be back on tomorrow with more discussion panels from the Mass Casualty Commission. I'll be watching most of it anyway, if it's not too nice out here in sunny Nova Scotia in the middle of the summer when many people probably won't be watching. This is so this week is mostly these discussion panels. Next week is going to be much more interesting, I think, because there will be actual witnesses. The leadership of the Nova Scotia RCMP, Darren Campbell, Chris Leather, and Lee Bergerman are going to be on the witness table next week, so we'll hear from them. But I'll be watching again the rest of the week as well and reporting to you anything of note. And so thanks again for watching today, and we'll see you next time.